Good morning. Now I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to get used to my accent, and remember that when you get to heaven, this will be God's accent. It was funny seeing Andy Calder doing the worship this morning, because Andy kindly invited me to Melbourne 2 years ago, I think it was. And I was doing a lecture on disability, and there was a lady sitting in front of me in a wheelchair who was sound asleep through the whole talk. And she came up to me at the end of the talk and said, I really enjoyed that, that was great. But I said to her, but you were sleeping all the way through. And she said, no, I couldn't get used to the dissonance between your face and your voice. So if you are having trouble with the distance between my face and my voice, just fall asleep and I'll understand. Terrible. I want this morning just to briefly talk about the issue of hospitality. Because it seems to me that underlying all of the conversations that we'll have, particularly in terms of bringing religions together in conversation, depends on how we understand and frame hospitality. But likewise, the relationship between those who claim the status of able-bodied and those who claim the status of disabled bodies is the same thing. How can we come together in all of our differences if we haven't learned the basic practices of hospitality? So I want us just to think about what hospitality means in the context of this conference, but also in the context of disability. When we think about hospitality, often many of us think about the L'Arche communities and the way that they've been formed in Jean Vanier. And we're going to speak a lot about L'Arche communities over the week, so I don't want to spend time on that. But there's one thing I want to draw out of Jean Vanier's call to form the L'Arche communities. Vanier says that he was called by God to form this particular way of living with one people in friendship and in the spirit of the Beatitudes. He was called by God to create a space for welcoming and a space for hospitality. In other words, welcoming and hospitality is something of the Word of God. It's something that God tells us to do and sends us into the world to do. L'Arche is a wonderful example of what can happen when that happens, but it's a part of a fundamental vocation of humanness to be called into the world, to welcome one another, and to be hospitable, in particular towards strangers. That's Jean Vanier. He's a good man. This is... I will not. I'm a happily married man. It's right. This is a... See, he's guilty. This is a picture of Pope Francis before he was Pope Francis. And he's kissing the feet of a child with AIDS, a dying child, effectively. And there's something very powerful in the imagery of this, of welcoming somebody who is profoundly othered by society, and reaching out and touching the untouchable, of welcoming into his presence someone who everybody else decided they don't want to welcome into their presence. And you can see the rhythm of hospitality in the midst of that. One of the things that you notice very clearly in the ministry of Jesus is there's a movement, there's a rhythm between being guest and host. Sometimes Jesus is guest, sometimes Jesus is host. And you've got that movement that kind of marks his ministry. And this picture really ties that in there. What does it mean to be a guest in the house of strangers? What does it mean to be a guest in the house of somebody who has advanced dementia? What does it mean for them to welcome you? What does it mean to be a guest in the house of a person with a profound mental illness? Because one of the tendencies always in relation to disability is that people tend to assume the role of host. But what if we turned that round in hospitality and began to think from the perspective of guesting and hosting. What would it mean if the idea of welcoming the unexpected guest actually applied to all of us? All of us are unexpected guests in the kingdom of God. And it's only through the movement of God towards human beings that we have any possibility of doing it. So the unexpected guest is not simply the person with disabilities, the person with a mental health problem, the outsider. The unexpected guest is all of us in that sense. And when you begin to shift your perspective and understand yourself as an unexpected guest, then everything begins to shift and change. Welcoming one another, and in that sense, being who we are, and attending to God by attending to one another. One of the beautiful things about the creation story is that idea that God creates us out of dust, God blows his nephesh, his spirit into us, and we come alive, and God sustains us. God sustains us through his nephesh, through his spirit. So each time we encounter one another, we encounter something of God. So in that sense, every meeting is a holy meeting. Every body is a holy place. And it's really important to think about that. What kind of relationships, what kind of hospitality, what kind of people would we become if we just suddenly began to realize that everybody is a holy place? And attending to God by attending to one another is the essence of any religious community, an essence of a truly human relationship. Now, tied in with that is the idea of hospitality requires integrity. And I think this is probably one of the most important things for us to think about over the next few days. One of the problems with many attempts to bring together the religions in different contexts and different perspectives is that there's a tendency to search after a common language. Hans highlighted that. To search for somewhere common and middle and unoffensive, inoffensive that we can meet, and then we can all talk there, we can all be there. And what always happens is we all collapse into this big one, and nobody really talks about anything apart from, let's try and be friends a little bit. I think the only way that we can bring our religious traditions together is by taking hospitality seriously. Now, by that I mean that if I'm a Christian and you're a Muslim and you're a Jew, then that's what I am. I speak that language, I talk that language. It may be difficult for you to understand, maybe it may be difficult for me to understand to begin with. But if we can be ourselves and talk together, then perhaps we'll become friends. And if we can become friends, then perhaps we can learn from one another without trying to overpower one another. So I think hospitality is fundamentally important between the religions and fundamentally important across the diverse community that we call the human race. And hospitality in relation to how we understand one another as people who have different bodies and different experiences is fundamentally important. I've been doing a lot of work recently in relation to people with dementia. And the one thing that you realize very quickly when you're with people with dementia, in the same way as you learn very quickly with people with profound intellectual disabilities, is that you need to shift your understanding of time. But first of all, before that, you have to realize, as St. Augustine puts it very clearly, that time is fallen. Augustine suggests that time comes into being with creation. When creation time falls with it. So there's something profoundly wrong with the way we use time, which is why we use time, we buy time, we sell time. All the things we do with our money, we do with our time. And most of us can't do some beautiful and wonderful things in life because we don't have time. There's something wrong with that. And when you get into the lives of people with these kind of cognitive difficulties, you have no option other than to slow down and take time and to begin to look at things differently. And at the heart of the kind of meditative understanding of hospitality that I'm trying to give to you is this idea of it comes from the mystical traditions or the contemplative traditions of the sacrament of the present moment. The sacrament of the present moment occurs when you begin to realize that you live in creation, when you begin to realize that time is a gift and not simply something there to be used and to be utilized. It begins to happen when you realize that time needs to be redeemed and put to its proper purposes in that sense. And when we begin to do that, then every moment that you exist has meaning. Every moment that you exist has purpose. And every moment that you exist should be put to the use that it's been divinely given to us to be used for. And sometimes when you're with people with dementia, you can see the profound significance of that. Because sometimes you'll be with people who are very confused, who've lost lots of their memory, but just for a moment and just at times, you find them. You catch them in a moment. And when you catch that person in that moment, you know that you've located yourself, you've locked into something that is wonderful and in one sense beyond time. It won't last for very long necessarily, but it is profoundly important. And it's a great example of using time properly. There's a little 10-minute video clip on YouTube. It's not on YouTube, it's on the internet. It's called 10 Glorious Seconds, and you should have a look at it. Maybe some of you have seen it. But it takes place in a couple's living room. And the man obviously has profound dementia. And the woman obviously has been looking after him for a quite considerable period of time. And it goes through their reactions, how frustrated she is, but in a very gentle and beautiful way, how she's disappointed by what's happening. And he's difficult, and sometimes he's violent. But at the same time, running through the film are pictures and images of this man when he was a boy, when he was in the army, when he was doing various things in his life. In other words, they held on to the wholeness and humanity of this person, but at the same time showed how difficult it was for somebody living and watching this. And then just at the end, the man gets up from his bed, and the woman catches his eye, and they walk towards one another, and they embrace. And she says, "Don't go, don't go." But of course he goes. But for these 10 glorious seconds, she had him in a way. And there's something both beautiful and both tragic about that. She was offering hospitality to somebody that she loved, even though that somebody that she loved had profoundly changed over time. The bonds of hospitality and love didn't shift, didn't change. But for her, these 10 glorious seconds were beautiful, but were also a source of deep lament, because there was something that came and something that went. I met a woman in Perth, Australia, earlier on this year, and she told me a story about her mum. And she said her mother had severe Alzheimer's disease, and really had forgotten who she was, forgotten who her mother was, forgotten most things. But then she had a stroke. And for whatever reason, she, in that sense, came back. And for some time, she remembered everything. She knew what it was. She knew where she was going. The woman phoned up the doctor, and the doctor said, yes, that sometimes happens, but it won't last. And so it lasted. So she phoned up her sister, brought them all to the house, and it lasted for 2 hours. And then it was gone. So it was beautiful, it was real, but then it was gone. And so lament and sadness, I think, is part of hospitality, because hospitality has to do with building strong bonds, bringing together the weak and the strong, and creating a community. But within that community, very often there's suffering, very often there's sadness, and I think we need to be very careful as disability theologians that we don't allow people to lament, because sometimes there is brokenness and sometimes there is loss. But there's two things that I'd want to think about in relation to that. First of all, he wasn't gone. He was still there. And so we mustn't allow our perceptions to drive the reality of our practices. But second, I think to be able to hold on to somebody when they seem to have gone requires a love that stands beyond the love that we can do by ourselves. It's a spiritual practice. It's a practice that requires training, in that sense, in the ways of faith. Faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you cannot see. To be trained in that way enables us to see and to hope and to give people the benefit of the doubt, even in the midst of clouds of confusion. Now, as I move towards the end, I'm just about finished, Bill. The hospitality, as well as being a way of bringing religions together, as well as being a way of understanding human difference, also requires a particular way of looking at the world. Hospitality is not simply being nice to one another, it's respecting one another, but also respecting the ways one another see the world. I worked as a mental health nurse for many years, and one of the things that always I find fascinating was the idea of psychosis, the idea that people exist in a world that's different from my own, and that there's strangeness about that world that I can never quite understand. There's a tendency just to pathologize it and to pretend it's not important, but there's something important, and crucial in fact, about understanding it differently. And the question that always came up to me was, whose reality counts? And I think that's a question for all of us. Whose reality counts? In what sense are we hospitable to the realities that are beyond our own? I spoke to a woman a couple of weeks ago who had schizophrenia but doesn't have it anymore. And one of the things that she said, which I had never even considered, was that one of her voices, a woman called Mary, she had been profoundly close to. And when she no longer had schizophrenia, when she no longer had these voices, she missed her. And she mourned for her. She's never been real, but she missed her, and she mourned for her. So there's something profoundly important about not discarding people's experiences, not discarding people's reality, because these realities may not be real to you or I, but they are real and they're profoundly important. So being hospitable to worldviews and reality beyond our own is equally as important. So finally, hospitality moves us towards belonging. And I know belonging is a word that we use quite a lot, and it's one that's come into vogue. But to belong to somebody, you need to be part of that community. You need to have people around you that notice you, that care for you, that really are there for you and will miss you when you're not there. Now, whether it means that you've got to be pulled up like that little yellow duck, or whether it means that that little yellow duck has to pull you down to help them to understand who you are, is an open question. But the point is that to belong, we need to be with one another in quite specific ways. So to belong, we need to be friends with one another, and we need to create places that have an ethos of homefulness. To be at home somewhere is where your heart is. It's where you know who you are. It's where your identity is formed. It's where your identity is sustained. So to belong and to create an ethos of homefulness, it opens up that space for hospitality. And in the midst of that are Christ-like friendships, or friendships of a particular mode within which they are motivated and driven towards bringing the outsider into the insider, and by bringing by doing that, changing the inside into the place where God lives. And finally, at the heart of hospitality is love. And Joseph Pieper defines love like this. It says, "It's good that you exist. I'm glad that you are here." And I can guarantee you that that works. Say it to your neighbor. It's good that you exist. I'm glad that you're here. Turn to the person beside you and say, it's good that you exist. I'm glad that you're here. You see? So I would say to you that that's exactly the message of how God is with human beings. It's good that you exist. I'm glad that you're here. That's the beginning point for hospitality. That's the beginning point for breaking down religious barriers, and that's the beginning point for breaking down barriers in relation to human difference. And finally, everybody has a place. The Apostle Paul says, "Don't you realize that all of you together are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God lives in you?" Now, you can work out for yourselves what you think that text means in relation to our meeting, but it means something important. Thank you.